privilege has become a hotly debated subject over the last few weeks. On the one hand, you have people who say you need to admit your privilege. In particular, what they mean by that is you need to admit your white privilege. In other words, you need to accept, by virtue of the fact that you are white, you have certain advantages that people who are black do not have. On the other hand, you have people who say privilege, it's a myth. There's no such thing as white privilege. The playing field is level. If you try hard enough, you will be able to succeed. There is no one who is holding you down. And that got me thinking, are there actually problems with both views? Firstly, the playing field is anything but level. Just because we may not be able to see obvious and explicit signs of discrimination, it doesn't mean it doesn't happen in more subtle ways in our society. And just because there are some wonderful stories of people who overcame the odds and their disadvantages to succeed, it doesn't mean that the system is fair. For some, succeeding is a lot easier than others. But there's also an issue in the way that we often talk about privilege. Privilege is often perceived to run down three particular lines, that of race, gender, and sexuality. So in other words, if you are a white, straight male, then you are triply advantaged. But if you are a black, lesbian female, then you are triply disadvantaged. Now, don't mishear me. I'm not saying that in certain contexts there aren't real advantages for those who are white, male, and straight. But is it too simplistic to think about privilege purely in those three areas alone? Or is it more complicated than that? For example, would a white farmer living in Moldova, the poorest country in Europe, be considered more advantaged and privileged than a black graduate of Oxford? You see, when we think about privilege, we have to realise that it works on far more levels than simply race, gender, and sexuality. Class would be another thing to consider, and certainly context has to be taken into account as well. Now, the problem with even questioning this is someone is sure to shout, that's your white fragility speaking. You don't like someone questioning your privilege, and you're desperately looking for ways to try and make yourself seem more disadvantaged so that you can claim more credit for your own success. Indeed, because of my pride, there is a temptation to do that. I could tell you that my grandparents on one side came to the UK as refugees. I could tell you that growing up we never got to go on foreign holidays. I could tell you that my education was in a bog standard comprehensive school, and all of those things would be true. But the fact is that I am also incredibly privileged. I am wealthier than 98% of people who live in the world. I have a passport that allows me to travel to most countries of the world. I've never faced obvious discrimination or abuse because of the colour of my skin. And being male has allowed me to progress as a public speaker in my context far easier than if I was female. I am incredibly advantaged in so many ways. What should we do then with this knowledge of our own privilege? Well, some would say you don't need to do anything. Just enjoy the privileges that you have. You deserve them. Other people would say, though, you need to confess your privileges. I'm not sure whether either approach is helpful, though. On the one hand, it is helpful for me to acknowledge my privileges. It's helpful for me to recognise that I have had certain advantages in life, and that should humble me when I'm tempted to think that the success that I have enjoyed in certain areas has been all my own doing. It hasn't. But on the other hand, perhaps an awareness of our privileges should lead us not so much to guilt, but to gratitude. And from that point of gratitude, maybe it should lead us to want to use our privileges, not for our own selfish ends, but for the benefit of others. As I reflected on these things, it made me think of some words in the Bible that are spoken about Jesus. You could say that Jesus was the most privileged person to ever walk the face of the earth. He is the Son of God. He was the creator of the universe. He will be the judge of history. That's all a pretty impressive resume, and none of those things were gained by unjust means. But listen to what these words say. Who, being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing, by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness and being found in appearance as a man. He humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. You see, Jesus didn't cling to his privileges, but out of love, he willingly relinquished his privileges for the sake of others, for the sake of you and me. And when our hearts have become gripped by the sacrificial love of Jesus, then when we face up to the reality of the privileges that we may have, it should also make us want to relinquish them in a Christ-like way for the sake and benefit of others. But more than that, when we come to know Jesus, when we come to know an intimate relationship with the God of the universe, we will then discover that that itself is the most ultimate and wonderful privilege that any of us could ever have. Writing in the very next chapter of the Bible, the Apostle Paul, who wrote those earlier words, went on to speak about his own privileges. He says, "If someone else thinks they have reasons to put confidence in the flesh, I have more. Circumcised on the 8th day, of the people of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews, in regard to the law, a Pharisee, as for zeal persecuting the church, as for righteousness based on the law, faultless." In other words, Paul is able to say he has incredible privileges. And yet listen to what he says in conclusion. "But whatever were gains to me, I now consider loss for the sake of Christ. What is more, I consider everything a loss because of the surpassing worth of knowing Christ Jesus my Lord, for whose sake I have lost all things. I consider them garbage that I may gain Christ." Paul was well aware of his privileges, and he was willing to give those privileges up for the sake of others. But he was also aware that the greatest privilege in his life was the privilege of knowing Jesus, of being loved by the God of the universe. And that privilege is totally undeserved. And it's also a privilege that is made available to all of us, whoever we are. I wonder, have you come to discover that privilege for yourself?